the Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things. Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. And today I'm lucky enough to be with Lee Gramling. Lee, could you give us a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
I'm a sixth-generation Floridian. I grew up hearing stories about the Florida frontier from my parents and my grandparents, and was very aware of Florida's history. I'm much more aware now than I was. And when I lived out in Oklahoma, I was introduced to the novels of Louis L'Amour, and I realized that Florida had the same kind of background that the Old West had, and so I thought it was time somebody wrote some stories about that.
Well, you are correct. And you call your Westerns, do you have a special name for them?
Cracker Westerns.
All right. Can you help our audience understand what that means? What's cracker mean?
Well, that's a long, long story. It's an old term. Actually, if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, it goes back to the 1500s. And it originally meant a loud, boastful person, but basically what it means is someone from Florida, Alabama, Georgia, who is of Scots-Irish stock, independent, ornery. We prefer that to mind our own business, and we kind of wish the government would do the same thing.
Tell us about what's been the most influential thing about your own writing?
Well, of course, Florida's history, and I have spent now probably 40-some years increasing my knowledge of it. But I try to write, like in the Western genre, I try to write action-adventure stories that are set on the frontier, and Florida definitely was a frontier, at least up until World War II.
And what creates a Western? How does that genre different from other genres?
Well, first of all, it's set on a frontier, which means a lot of different things, but it means that people are independent. It means the land really becomes a character in the story. And we have a lot of elements in the traditional Westerns that also occurred in Florida. Florida has always been a major cattle producer. You had boom towns, outlaws, saloons, everything that they had out west. It's not as well known, probably because of the arrival of the mouse.
How much research do you use to put into your novels?
Well, like I say, I've been reading about Florida's history now for 40 or 50 years. I don't necessarily do an awful lot for any individual novel anymore. I like to make sure that the places, the towns particularly that I name, really were there and really were there at the time that I'm writing about them. You have to know about weapons in the different periods and basically what life was like in the different periods of our history.
How many novels have you written?
I have 7 in print. I've written a couple others, but they haven't been published.
And how do you think the combination of using the landscape as a character and the history of Florida help bring your novels to life?
Well, the landscape or the land itself creates both barriers and opportunities. You have to get from one place to another, and 150 or 200 years ago, that was not easy at all because there weren't really any roads. And you have to think about whether you're going through a swamp or a forest or over open plains. All of that affects transportation, and it also affects things. My novels, of course, like any Western, involve conflict and a certain amount of shooting. And you have to think about tactical effects of the different variations of the landscape. And you have to, I'm writing one now that is set in about 1813. And you have to realize that there were no multiple shot weapons. Everything was a single shot weapon. And fight was more as likely as not to take place with knives as it was with guns. So those are some kinds of things that you have to consider.
Do you have a favorite landscape that you like to portray?
Not particularly. We made a determination, me and my publishers at Pineapple Press made a determination that every novel would take place in a different part of Florida. So I have novels set in northern Florida and in the Everglades and on the West Coast, in South Central Florida with a lot of cattle business. So I kind of move it around. I even have one set in West Florida.
Do you use, I'm fascinated with the landscape and the way you mentioned it. And I know that it does offer a lot of challenges for characters. Having lived in Florida, we understand that, you know, any given spot, there's a lake or a marsh that you have to go around in order to get from one spot to another. But do the characters travel over vast areas, or do they pretty much stay in one section?
They travel. It sort of depends on what the novel is, but as it's turned out, they mostly travel. My first novel, I had them start out in St. Augustine and go all the way across the state to Hog Island, which is near Cedar Keys, and that was in 1876, so there was absolutely no road at all. What you find out is that the best way to travel is usually by water.
I'll buy that. So you've written 7 novels, and are you working, and you have 2 that have not been published. Are those 2 of the first ones you had?
No, I have a first novel, which is not Florida-based, and it's in the back of my file cabinet. It will never see the light of day. Everybody has to write a first novel and get it out of the way so they can get to the real stuff. But the 2 I'm working on now are more lately. I'm doing rewrites, and maybe I'll get them published, and maybe I won't. I don't know, because obviously Westerns are not particularly woke.
So you said you have a publisher. What's it like working with a publisher?
It works out, well, it worked out very well with June Cusson. The Cussons, June and David Cusson, founded and ran Pineapple Press until they retired. And I got along very well with them, and I found, which I think should always be the situation, I found it to be a very good cooperative relationship. They kept me anchored and from going off on wild tangents.
Will you have a publisher for your upcoming novels? Are you searching for one?
No, I have. The imprint is still Pineapple Press, but it's under a much larger publisher now. The Roman Littlefield, which is the overall publisher, but they bought the Pineapple Press imprint, so it's still under Pineapple Press, and you can still find Pineapple Press on the internet.
Oh, well, that's good. That's good. And are you working on any new novels?
Well, like I say, I'm kind of in the process. It's a long process anyway. You write it and you think it's wonderful, and you start rereading it and you realize it's not so wonderful after all, and then you have to go back to work on it. So that's kind of where I am at right now, and I'm working on one of them, and I'll come back to the second one, and when I think they're ready to be published, I'll submit them.
Tell me about advice you received when you started out as an author.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure anybody really gave me much advice, although they probably should have. What I had to do, I got almost a PhD. I spent about 12 years in college, and I had to unlearn all of the academic writing I ever did and try to make it move faster and be interesting.
I've heard that from many authors.
I'm not surprised.
Well, what advice would you offer somebody, or that you should have had?
Well, several things. I think if somebody is beginning, the important thing is to get your butt in the chair. I mean, that is the first thing. If you don't sit down and start writing, you will not write anything. And there's a lot of people that think about it, and I hear a lot of people that are almost my age saying, well, I have always thought about writing a novel, and I try to be polite, but I'm tempted to say, well, why the hell didn't you do it? You never find out anything if you don't sit down and start writing. Beyond that, the main thing, there are a lot of advice that people can give, and as a matter of fact, the Florida Writers website has a periodic essays that are really pretty helpful. But the main thing is make it move, make it into a page turner, make people want to read the next page.
Tell me about the characters you create.
They're all independent and self-sufficient, and that includes women as well as men. The novel I'm working on right now, I wrote a novel, had a novel published a few years back called War Clouds Over West Florida, in which I introduced a young lady that I kind of fell in love with and decided I ought to write another novel with her as the central character. So that's what I'm doing now. But they have to be strong and they have to be independent, and they don't go whining to people. If there's something needs doing, they do it. And if they don't do it, it doesn't get done.
Do you find writing a sequel challenging?
Not particularly, and I don't like to think of it as a sequel. I never write series, I should say, because it drove me nuts on several occasions when I picked up number 2 in a series and realized I needed to know what was in number 1 before I could read number 2. So my stories don't stick together. I sometimes use the same characters, but it doesn't require the reader to have read anything ahead of time.
Lee Gramling, how can people get in touch with you?
I have a website if they want to find out a little more. It's Lee Gramling, LeeGramling.com. And I'm available on the internet at lggwriter@gmail.com. I do not publish my telephone number.
Well, Lee, are you ready to switch to our rapid fire questions?
We'll give it a shot.
Do you have any favorite souvenirs that you've collected from over the years?
One or two. One that I like, although I don't use it much anymore. I got had a cow whip made. People think of it as a bullwhip, but cow whips are much shorter and they have a wooden handle. And in Florida, they didn't use lassos. If you've been out in the Florida woods, you know that you get all tangled up real quick with a lasso. So in Florida cow hunting, they used cow whips and catch dogs.
Do you subscribe to any magazines that come in the mail?
A few, none that have much to do with my writing. My daughter writes for a publication called Science News, and I get that just so I can kind of keep track of what she's writing. And I also get World War II magazine. Military history is kind of my second passion. But I don't have any, I don't find much use in reading frontier magazines because they all have to do with the West, and there is very few of them have anything to do with Florida.
Final question. What is your favorite breakfast food?
Probably ham and cheese omelet.
Nice.
Yeah, everything goes with it. I'm not a big fan of grits, but of course I grew up with them, so I'll eat them if they're given to me.
Well, Lee Gramling, thank you so much for stopping by.
My pleasure.
You have been listening to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. Alison out. Woo! We're all done. Lee Gramling is a sixth-generation Floridian who grew up hearing tales of the Florida frontier from his parents and grandparents. While living in Oklahoma, he was introduced to the novels of Louis L'Amour and realized that old Florida had all the same elements featured in Western action-adventure series, had cattle drives, outlaws, boomtowns, saloons, shootouts, and rugged individuals who knew how to survive in an untamed frontier. For more information on Lee and his cracker westerns, visit leegramling.com. For more information on the Florida Writers Association, visit us at floridawriters.org. Until next time.